This is a board work session. It is Wednesday, September 28th. It is 9:04 a.m. This is a hybrid work session. And if you would like to see this online, you can watch through the Thurston County YouTube live stream. I'm Carolina Mejia. I'm the chair of the board. In the boardroom is Vice Chair Ty Menser, and joining us via Zoom is Commissioner Gary Edwards. In the boardroom as well, we have County Manager Ramiro Chavez, as well as Assistant County Manager Robin Campbell, as well as other staff members who will be presenting on today's topic, which is the A24 Emergency Housing Ordinance Permitting Criteria Flexibility.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a little bit of a background. This is related to the interim emergency housing ordinance. The board has approved just about 5 times, or renewed 5 times over the last few years. The board made a decision to consider this to be a permanent item, and you included on the docket, and that is the 824. What you will see here today is the work behind that, also how the Planning Commission has provided a perspective on this, and then we will ask you to provide some next steps, not necessarily today, maybe next Tuesday morning. With that, Chris?
All right. I don't have a whole lot since we have a short amount of time. Maya, you want to start the presentation?
Yep, I'm going to share my screen and Leah will be presenting today.
Good morning, Commissioners. Leah Davis with Community Planning. Maya Atipal and I will cover the progress staff has made with the Permanent Emergency Housing Ordinance Permitting Criteria Flexibility. Next slide, please. Today, we will provide an overview of docket item A24 from the 2022 Official Development Code docket. We'll provide an overview of the Planning Commission recommendation and request direction to schedule a public hearing. Next, please. So adopting permanent regulations to replace the interim emergency housing ordinance is priority 12 of 18 on the docket. Like the interim regulations, the permanent regulations apply to the rural county and the urban growth areas of Lacey, Tumwater, and Olympia. Next. This amended ordinance makes the interim regulations permanent and consider some additional amendments to improve the regulations. As a reminder, the homeless encampment ordinance has been in place since 2010. The interim regulations have been in place since 2019, and as the county manager stated, they have been renewed by the board 5 times. They are considered temporary until the adoption of the permanent regulations. And to date, no encampment has been permitted under the ordinance. Next. As you may remember and have seen in the draft included in your packet, during a declared crisis, some of the regulations are waivable. These have been carried over from the interim ordinance. So the director may waive things such as an on-site parking regulations, location regulations, requirements for screening, the requirement for a security plan, visitor regulations, and the requirement for an ID numbering system. The director may not waive the requirement for sanitary portable toilets and screening toilets from adjacent property, the requirement for temporary structures to conform to building codes, the fire safety requirements, the requirement for a code of conduct agreement, and the director may not waive the prohibition of illegal drugs, fighting, abuse, and littering. Next, please. So in this draft, there are some amendments that go beyond what the interim regulations had. Staff created these amendments for 2 reasons. One, county commissioners asked staff to research ways to make the regulations work better, and a permit application for an RV camp last fall to light some areas of the permitting and review process that were unclear. So the changes staff made for those reasons are clarification of the permitting procedures and regulations for the informational meeting. A step was added for the director to review waived regulations with the commissioners prior to permit issuance. And any appeal of an encampment permit will go directly to Superior Court. Encampments are no longer allowed in critical areas or their buffers. Heating and cooking appliances in RVs are always allowed, and it increases the permit duration from 6 months to 1 year. Next, please. So next are additional amendments proposed by the Planning Commission that go beyond those in the interim regulations. These were also included in the draft in your packet. The public informational meetings, the requirement for that are no longer waivable. They will be required every time. There is now a cap on the number of residents to a 100% increase over what the ordinary ordinance allows. Included is a recommendation that safe storage be provided for weapons. It leaves the restriction of alcohol up to the sponsoring agency. And it requires a consultation and agreement from Thurston County Risk Management before waiving the requirement for liability insurance. So I'd like to add a footnote here. After the Planning Commission made their recommendation, staff had further internal discussions about the requirement for liability insurance. This information was not available to PC prior to their recommendation. Staff recommends moving forward with a draft that does not allow a waiver for general liability insurance. And the reasons are that Public Health and Social Services did not say that the requirement for insurance is a barrier to sponsoring a camp. We feel it is clearer and fairer to all applicants to not have this requirement discretionary on a case-by-case basis. It helps protect the public, and that on-site conditions can change after a permit is issued, maybe increasing liability issues. And it would be difficult for staff to assess the need for liability insurance. This can be changed in the future if needed to make that waivable. Next slide, please. So during research and review, staff worked with Thurston County Public Health and Social Services, the Sheriff's Department, and Development Services to draft the proposed amendments. And to date, no public comment has been received. Next, please. Here is the Planning Commission recommendation approval of the proposed amendment. It was approved by a 7-to-1 vote with 1 absent. Next. So staff has laid out a timeline for the permanent and interim regulations. The permanent ordinance timeline overlaps with the interim ordinance timeline. Because the interim regulations expire December 9th and have to be renewed through a public hearing, staff is prepared to start the process to renew the interim ordinance if additional time is needed for review of the permanent regulations. Next. So are there any questions?
Questions? Commissioner Edwards.
I think my initial question would just be, did we ever get anything in on any of the criteria that prioritizes those individuals that are residents or some type of resident issue on any of the regulatory stuff? That would be my question.
You kind of broke up during that question, and I'm not clear on what the question is. Could you repeat it?
Yes. Do you have anything in there that refers to or prioritizes a residency issue so that we prioritize giving access to a facility to those residents that have fallen on hard times. And basically, it would discourage people from coming from Kansas City to set up camp.
There isn't anything included in this draft along those lines.
Okay, thank you very much.
Questions, Commissioner Menser?
Leah, going back to the beginning, you mentioned during a declared crisis, and I'm just wanting a little clarification on that. Does this ordinance only apply if the county has done a homelessness as a crisis, or what does that mean? What is that? How does that restrict the usage of this tool?
Well, what it has done is incorporate the interim regulations into the ordinance, the permanent ordinance, so that if there is a declared crisis, some of those requirements can be waived. Once the declared crisis no longer exists, then there are no waivable regulations. Does that clarify it?
So all of this only happens if there's a declared crisis? Declared by who?
The waivable regulations only happen during a declared crisis. The homeless encampments ordinance is present all the time. The waivable things are only available during a declared crisis.
And the declared crisis would be by the Board of County Commissioners or the Board of Health.
Correct.
But we had one in 20.
Correct, we have one now, and that's why there are interim ordinances to allow for waivable items within our temporary homeless encampment ordinance.
Does that declaration ever end?
No, it doesn't have a sunset.
That's correct.
And I know we've gone through this, but it's really been a couple of years since we've gone to the, to the real underpinning of how this is all structured.
Correct.
And I'm not remembering. So there is an ordinance that with non-waivable elements that doesn't need a crisis to be utilized.
That is correct.
And the idea is just that I'm trying to get at. Is there an instance in which that ordinance would be of any use?
So the temporary homeless encampment land use policy and ordinance was put into place in 2010 in order to address observed homeless encampments that were starting to pop up in scattered areas. And we wanted to make sure that the temporary housing of people was done in an orderly fashion in areas and with some regulations that made sure that we had environmental and health and safety in mind, while still providing an area for people to live and then get help. And the permitting process is a little longer under those sets of rules than it would be if someone came in under the waiver if there was an emergency declaration by the board.
And then so these could be done, they could be done a little quicker because we're responding to an emergency and.
Absolutely.
Okay. My second question was, I don't understand this piece on, let's see if I can find it. Well, the thing about, I think this was a planning commission ad, 100% increase on the resident cap. That's referring to this other ordinance that you're talking about?
Correct. So at the moment.
And what are those caps? Like, what are we talking about in terms of quantity of people?
Right. So at the moment, Leah, can you let us know what the cap is for the number of people on a site or at a homeless encampment?
The number of people is dependent on the size of the site. So there are regulations about the distance from the edge of a parcel that tents or other shelters could be constructed or put up, and the distance between shelters. So that would be the basic ordinance. And then during a crisis, a declared crisis, there is a waiver available to increase that number of residents to up to 100%.
And so right now, the ordinance for if there's no emergency waiver or no crisis declared, we allow for 40 persons in an encampment. Under a declared crisis, that could be waived to allow up to 80, so a 100% increase of that number. But as Leah said, there are site conditions that are evaluated when considering how many people would be allowed, but 80 is the maximum under a crisis.
So 40 is the max, but it could be under the existing ordinance. 40 is the max, but it could be less based on site limitations or conditions. And so 80 would be the max, you know, period under this if we adopted that.
That's correct.
XCP. Okay. Those are my big questions.
Okay, thank you. I see we have Chair Casino in the boardroom, and if it's okay with the other two commissioners, I would kind of like to hear from him and kind of some of the conversation pieces from the Planning Commission. Do you mind coming? Not to put you in the spot or anything.
Well, I'm not sure where to start with you, but you know, we did have quite a few work sessions on this, and there was some diversity of opinion there, but there's a lot of things that we agreed upon pretty well. But I think that the things that we didn't agree upon are probably the things that you guys might want to ponder the most. The whole issue with risk management and insurance, that the new information that came forward, that all makes sense, and I think that the Planning Commission would have agreed with the new staff recommendation if they had the time. But the things that we did disagree about on were whether or not to allow an operator to have a barrier or to put up barriers because of drugs. We had some planning commissioners that did not want to mandate any kind of barriers on operators. They wanted to leave it up to the operator to have a low barrier camp if they wanted to. And then there was also some conversations about whether or not we should apply these to the UGAs and the unincorporated county, or just restrict this to the UGAs and not have these emergency ordinances for the unincorporated county. And the other thing that was kind of tangential to all of this, but it wasn't directly related, was something that Commissioner Mincer kind of touched on, and the metrics for starting the emergency and the metrics for ending the emergency were very unclear. And without being able to know exactly how an emergency starts or stops, it was difficult to decide whether or not this was something that was needed or necessary, or if this is, you know, this is really an emergency if this is more endemic and part of our lives now. So that was a real concern for us, but that was kind of tangential to the whole idea of the EHO in general.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any clarification questions?
I guess I would ask on the low barrier or UGA or rural, what was the final outcome that you decided on?
So I believe that we decided that we were not going to allow a operator to waive the requirement for not allowing illegal drug use. And then the Planning Commission also decided that these should apply to all areas of the county, not just the UGAs.
So on that point, or the previous point, okay, I see. So with regard to alcohol, was yours a change from the staff draft or whatever, or like
About the illegal drug use, I don't think alcohol was ever in question. It was
Okay.
illegal drug use.
Well, you've got and I'm looking at Chris, you've got a bullet point on here that says make the prohibition on alcohol discretionary and left to the sponsoring agency as one of the Planning Commission recommendations. Is that a change from what was taken to them?
That is a change from our interim ordinance at the moment.
What does the interim ordinance say?
The interim ordinance allows alcohol as a Go ahead.
Sorry, it prohibits alcohol outright.
See, that's what I thought. So I was seeing this as the planning commission being more permissive on the alcohol point based on how I'm reading this.
Yeah.
But not having, agreement on no illegal drugs not being waivable. And I could live with either one of those myself,
Yeah.
but that makes sense.
So the alcohol wasn't the issue, but the planning commission didn't like allowing illegal drug use.
Maybe that's. Okay, I don't think I have anything else.
Yeah, or would you
Okay,
be
go
done?
ahead.
The location possibility of UGA or rural areas of the county. Was there anything in as far as needed to have transit available?
Yeah, I believe that those requirements are waivable, though there was a requirement about how close an encampment had to be to a public bus stop,
Okay.
and that's a waivable requirement.
That's correct.
And it has been the whole time, hasn't it?
It has.
Under the permanent it's waivable. Correct?
Correct. Under the interim ordinance, the location to a bus stop is a waivable item that the director can make during an application review process.
And now, maybe one other thing, did enforcement become whether or not it was feasible or not for the alcohol, beer, whatever?
That was gonna be up to the operator to do that, so I get,
Well, I'm just wondering if the planning commission felt that that was kind of an unenforceable thing, is why.
oh, it's certainly unenforceable. We did have discussions about that,
Yeah.
that if we're gonna tell these people they can't do something, there's no enforcement mechanism, it seems a little ridiculous.
Sure, okay, thank you.
So the next steps would be to either to move forward with a public hearing, and it would be to choose either the planning commission recommendation or the staff recommendation, correct?
That's correct. We would request that the board make a decision on which liability insurance language to move forward for the final draft, and we would request to set a public hearing.
Unless commissioners would like extra information. But
Correct.
hearing.
Well, it sounded to me like it's a friendly amendment to the planning commission, this thing about the liability
The
insurance.
planning commission was very skeptical about dropping or having a waiver for insurance, and then the PAO came back and said, with these tons of conditions, we could probably do it. And so the planning commission was like, well, all right. And then with the new information, I guess, they decided no. So the planning commission would be fully on board with not having that waiver, I'm sure of it.
I would support the planning commission's version of the ordinance with the change, staff recommended change on liability insurance, is kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at too. Commissioner Edwards?
I'm not thrilled about the ordinance in general, just because it allows people to move from New York City, move in on us. And that's my main concern. Other than that, I go along with my evenings.
Okay. So you have direction? So we're gonna move forward with a public hearing. So if staff will bring forward an AIS to set on one of our future agenda settings. We're going to move forward with the planning commission recommendation with the staff recommendation in terms of the liability and wage insurance, yes.
Wonderful.
Excellent. Thank you, commissioners.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Maya, Josh.
And I'd like to thank staff and the planning commission for all the hard work that went into this, whether I agree or not with the outcome. It's still a lot of work.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.